Hello, my name's Emily Grant. I am an independent sheep and beef consultant based in Perthshire, and I'm also a sheep farmer. My work is mainly revolving around grazing management systems and finding sustainable beef and sheep systems. So this webinar is the fourth in the series looking at sustainable systems, and today we're going to be discussing grazing management. So really, yeah, growing pasture is reasonably easy, but the real challenge is being able to match animal feed needs within the seasonality of pasture growth. We're all well aware that pasture is our or graze pasture is our cheapest feed available. So, in order to maximise that, we need to really be making the most of grazing. And as you can see in the picture here, there's a real challenge, and particularly within our climate, for ensuring that we have the right amount of pasture available for the right stage of production. And particularly here, we can see with ewes with twins, and their pasture demands or their nutritional demands are quite high in the spring. But that's a real challenge to ensure, and particularly where the vagaries of the weather as well. But to ensure that there's sufficient pasture available to allow those ewes to be able to lactate well off early spring pasture and to have really good lamb growth rates. So I think this slide really kind of sums up actually a little bit of how I see, and I think others probably see grazing management as well. So there's probably a key kind of set of rules. So it's a bit like a board game. So there's rules in there, but then within that you'll have strategies that will enable you to achieve your aims. And really, the three key rules probably are, in terms of grazing management, is being able to try and match supply and demand. That's number one. Number two is about maintaining pasture quality and quantity. So we want stock to perform well off pasture. And in order to do that, they need to have enough and enough of high quality pasture to be able to do that. And number three is really the challenge in it is about being flexible in management. So particularly weather will throw in variables for us that, and no year seems to be a typical year, and we're increasingly seeing challenging years as we're going forward. So it's really important that you're flexible in your management and able to be able to get the best out of your pastures. So then in terms of playing the game, really, this is about the tools available, the strategies available. And we'll cover these through as we go through the presentation, but the kind of tools we do have available are things like stocking rates. So what is the normal stocking rate for the unit? Is that stocking rate right for the unit, for the amount of grass that you can grow? We'll also have within that the stocking policy. So what are the classes of stock? Do you have breeding stock? Do you just have finishing stock? Etc. So, for example, are you a store producer, or are you a finisher, breeder finisher? There's lots of different classes, and particularly in sheep and beef systems, we can actually see quite a lot of different classes of stock on one unit, unlike other grazing systems such as dairy, where it tends to be slightly more simplified in terms of its stock classes. The other thing that we have control of as well is about timing of production. So particularly that would refer mostly to calving and lambing date, but also to things like weaning times and point of sale as well. And that brings us on to that third point there, that timing of sale or purchase, if you are somebody who purchases in stock or purchases in stores to finish. We also have within there the method that we use to control the rate of feed use. So, but that really means grazing. So there's a variety of grazing systems that we see now. We with all sorts of names to describe, but we can see the more kind of intensive New Zealand style high utilisation grazing rotational systems, and we also see less intensive mob grazing, where the aim is to have quite high density impact, but also to leave some of that as a trample into the soil. Plant species, that's also another option that we have, or a tool that we have. So we can use different plant species to help us achieve that supply and demand. So that could be through forage crops, or even within grass clover systems, or into mixed species swaths. And another one, conservation policy, about when we decide, and if we decide when we need to be making or taking surpluses out for cutting for silage and or hay. But that gives us flexibility, and it also actually gives us the ability to reset pastures if we're losing control of the grazing platform. And finally, within there as well, we've got fertiliser policy. So when you apply fertiliser and how much fertiliser you apply can have an impact on when you encourage growth. And particularly, I think we see some people starting to split fertiliser applications into small amounts earlier in the spring once soil temperatures are warm enough, but just to try and give that early boost, and then another small amount in early in the autumn as well, just to, again, when soil temperatures are still good, but just allows that final kind of flush of grass growth to take some of the pasture a little bit further into the autumn. I think I just wanted to put this picture up as just as an example of as well the different types of pasture-based systems we can have here. So obviously you can see there's the full range of pasture types from Heather Hill down into upland ground. Particularly see where there's whins there, probably only growing about 5-6 tons. The hills probably only growing a couple of 2 to 3 tons of dry matter. And then as we start to move down into the lower ground, where there's a lot more opportunity in pasture production. In these fields, as you start to move down, you can also have the opportunity for reseeding or growing alternative crops on those fields as well. So there's a real range, and it's really important about considering what resources you have and how best to utilise them with your grazing management. So it's really important to have a clear management strategy when you're deciding on how to implement grazing management on your farm. So be really clear about what your objectives are. And I think probably for most people, those objectives will be about output, i.e. maximising live weight gain for a product that is sellable. Also, we're increasingly starting to see, and as policy changes as well, there are probably objectives towards things like biodiversity, so grazing management to help support biodiversity, and also in terms of carbon storage as well, and particularly seeing more arable units starting to reintroduce livestock. So be really clear about what your objectives are and how you can help to implement that through the decisions and the management decisions that you have. Resources, that's quite important. Again, thinking back to the picture that I just put up, I mean, what type of pastures have you got? What species within that? How productive are there? It's so important to have a bit of a handle on understanding how much grass you're capable of growing on your unit, because that's really the starting point for deciding things like stock classes, stock numbers, etc. And also that ties back into things like biodiversity as well. So are you in a more upland or permanent pasture type of situation as well, where there's maybe already existing native species? They all have a big impact on what you decide. And again, yeah, your stock class, your stock numbers. What are the kind of stocks, what are the systems you're running? Are you a mix of cattle and sheep? Are you just cattle? Are you just sheep? So they're kind of the big picture things. And then moving down, that's our management, that's our decisions, and the day-to-day decisions or season-to-season decisions that we make that help us help drive a profitable system. So as alluded to earlier, it's things like your purchase or your sale dates, your conservation date for cutting of hay or silage, tactical fertiliser application, etc. All these decisions that can impact. But it's also really important to make sure that once you set up a system that you're continually monitoring it. And by monitoring it, I really mean your livestock performance, because you still want stock to perform, but also things like pasture cover and pasture height. They're really good, simple measures that can help just give you that constant feedback as have you got your system set up quite right? Are you achieving your aims and objectives? Okay, so going back to the first rule, which is about matching supply and demand. So this is a pretty typical, the green line that you'll see in here is a reasonably typical, it's a bit rough and ready, but a reasonable typical chart just showing feed pasture growth throughout a season. And as I don't need to tell you really is, but really low, we have low pasture growth over the winter periods, and then particularly high pasture growth in spring, late spring as well. We have really high pasture growth rates. And then moving down into summer, depending how dry you are in the summer, we can see those pasture growth rates drop a little bit before rising once we start to get a bit of rain in the autumn. We're starting to see, and it's really useful, things like Grass Check GB or wherever you're in the country, all the similar grass measuring information portals that are out there will help give you an idea of what seasonal patterns are looking like. And really, yeah, the key issue is the blue line in there is showing a typical demand for a spring calving system. So that's just spring calving cows, selling stores. And as you can see, the challenge becomes about how we deal with the deficit when we're not growing enough grass for demand, but then the surplus when we have too much grass for demand. And I think this chart shows this quite well, because it's kind of breaking down all the growth across the season and when that growth happens. And as I alluded to before, that April, May, June time, so spring into early summer is when we're seeing most of our pasture growth on our farms here. Now you'll have variations across the country, but that's really where we're seeing most of the pasture growth happening. And it's really challenging to be able to consume this growth, particularly in our systems where we don't necessarily have huge scope to be able to suddenly increase stock numbers to match it. And also, I think that chart really well illustrates that how little growth that we have in that autumn moving into the winter period as well. So again, that then becomes a challenge if we have a significant number of stock on the farm in the winter. It's just how do we manage those periods of almost like oversupply and then undersupply within that. And yes, making a forage, cutting of silage is a useful way to do that. But how can we manage to make more from grazing so that we're not incurring a significant cost within the system? Okay, so this really becomes about options to flatten the curve. So that really what that means is trying to match supply and demand better. So the opportunity we have are taking decisions on things like buying and selling. So that could be particularly if you have opportunity to sell store rather than fat. It could be to take on grazers. So some people who may be sheep only systems sometimes take on summer grazing with cattle. That just helps them to control and manage that high summer growth period. And actually, it's really important to note as well that period, particularly in that springtime and late spring, is really the time when we effectively have free grass and everything's operating. We've always got grass coming ahead of us, and it's really the time that we need to be maximising profit, maximising growth rates off whatever stock we're selling, because that's the cheapest time that we can do that. Putting grazing stock off, so you may have opportunities to away winter some of your stock if that helps with flattening your grass curve, but also things like manipulating lambing and calving dates and weaning dates. And for those who managed to join last week on the nutrition webinar, we saw charts of what happens when you shift a lambing date by a month, and just how much better you can match that supply and demand by making sure that you're lambing at the time when you're about to hit that peak grass growth so that ewes can lactate really well. And weaning dates as well. Weaning dates are reasonably flexible, and we'll probably come on to later how you deal with dry periods and making those decisions on weaning dates. So although we'll probably talk about rotational grazing a wee bit, there's even within all our grazing management systems, there's opportunities to have a variety of different management regimes in place, and certainly there is an opportunity to set stock during rapid pasture growth. And basically this is because effectively you're giving animals the opportunity to eat all the pasture that's in front of them. So set stocking, as we know, is generally we get really good high production per head from set stocking for that reason, that stock aren't limited at all in what they're eating. But we tend to find that because pasture doesn't have a rest period, that you're not growing as much pasture, so your total stocking rate per hectare tends to be less. So it's a balancing act of that. And what we're starting to see, and certainly aware of a couple of farms that are trying this now, where you have a mixing of stock classes, particularly cattle, suckler cows with calves generally have lower intake and dry matter requirements, nutritional requirements than ewes with twins, and they can be used as a bit of a tool to help tidy up or help manage that surplus pasture. And I've occasionally seen some people who are basically set stocking on set stocking ewes within a field, having cows and calves behind a wire who follow through, so that effectively the cows and calves are on rotation behind the ewes. The ewes have free access to the whole field, single wire for the cows and calves, and those cows and calves are used to tidy up behind the ewes and lambs, and just keeping that pasture in its vegetative stage. And if ewes and lambs are looking a little bit tight as they're getting to the end of that field, then they, maybe a day ahead, can shift through to the next field as they go through, so that ewes and lambs always have that really nice fresh bite ahead of them, and they're not restricted at all in the pasture that's available for them. Another opportunity we have is thinking back to that winter period in particular. That's always becomes our kind of highest cost, or when actually our pastures to graze have their highest value. Obviously, because we're not constantly growing grass within the winter period, so we need to be able to manage that winter grass as well as possible, so that we can come through winter whilst having sufficient covers in spring to enable that spring growth to really happen quickly. So it's important then to make sure that there's probably, or one of the best ways to achieve this is just to make sure that there's minimum grazing stock on the winter platform to enable you to do this. And to do that, we can do that by just aiming for having stock who need to be kept at maintenance only, or for whom lower growth rates are fine. So typically that'll mean just having ewes, if you're out wintering cattle as well, just making sure that they're in good body condition score, that ewes as well are on condition score, an average of condition score 3. And if we'll cover off compensatory growth, but also if you have young stock grazing out, is just to accept a lower per head per day growth rate and then use compensatory growth gain later. So yeah, also it's there's value in using that body condition score, particularly on suckler cows, to help get through the winter, and we'll cover that in a second. And I suppose I think this slide just really demonstrates about the nutritional, the energy requirements for stock as they go through the production cycle. And this shows for a spring calving suckler cow, and as you can see, early in lactation, her demands are really pretty high, so that's quite nice. That can tie in well with our spring pasture growth, and when we've got a lot of pasture coming ahead of us. And then we can see that drop in lactation at about 6-7 months old, and there's flexibility within that weaning date. And then once lactation's finished, then you're onto a much lower level of requirement until she gets close to calving again. So it's about using those dates, about using your calving date well, and about making decisions on weaning so that you can minimise the suckler cow's energy requirements. And the same applies for sheep as well. You can be flexible in that weaning time in order to then pull those ewes back down to maintenance, and use them as a tool then more to manage as you change your priority, or you change your focus onto finishing lambs or finishing calves. Okay, so using body condition score, this really applies to suckler cows. Its ewes are slightly different and I suppose particularly because they have a much shorter gestation period, and they're much more metabolically sensitive, and particularly prolific ewes, so ewes with twins, and really they need their body condition score pre-lambing to be able to take them through those early days of lactation. So this really is applying to cattle, but some of the fundamentals behind what I'll say also apply to sheep. So what are the positives of using body condition score? So for beef cattle, each kilogram of live weight lost will give her 28 megajoules of ME. So effectively, having good body condition score is almost like having grass on our back. So it's a bank. The body condition score, her fat, is a bank of energy. Controlling live weight loss at 0.5 kilo per day will then give her an equivalent of about 14 megajoules of ME per day. So controlled weight loss rather than rapid weight loss is normally recommended. And this 14 megajoules of ME a day can provide a 640 kilo dry cow with approximately 20% of her daily ME requirements. So I think that starts to demonstrate, well, so what's the benefit of using body condition score on cows over the winter? And particularly of that maintenance, they're at the lowest energy levels anyway, or energy requirements. So that can add a significant amount by using that body condition score. But what are the negatives? So there's always a downside to an upside. But each kilo of live weight gained requires 55 megajoules of ME. So to put fat on is more expensive to do. But equally, as we thinking back to the graph or when our pasture grows, as we go through summer into early autumn, we generally still have greater supply than demand. And that's a really good opportunity to be making sure that body condition score is good. And I know some people who make sure, particularly if they are out wintering cows, to make sure that they're carrying really good condition as they move into the winter. And when we're talking about the relative value of pasture, so as I said, in wintertime, that pasture is worth so much more to us, but is worth proportionately less over the summer. That's one of the benefits of using body condition score, is that we're taking cheaper pasture, banking it onto our back, and then using that over the winter from her fat store. But it's also important to remember that reducing body condition score at key production times can impact on performance and fertility. So no extremes, still keep within targets, and just manage that body condition score carefully. And I'll reiterate again, this really applies to suckler cows. It's a much harder thing to do with ewes. And as I said, ewes really require that body condition score. And there's so much data behind maintaining target body condition score for ewes over winter. Okay, so using compensatory gain. So this really applies to young stock. So compensatory gain is effectively the natural ability to undergo rapid periods of growth following a period of restricted nutrition. So it's kind of a rebound effect. But it requires plenty of high quality feed to support that higher intake in the spring. So what we'll see once stock are back out onto real high quality feed, their intake also increases as well. So to maximise that rebound effect, it's important that it's not just the spring turnout, it's spring turnout onto really good, plenty high quality feed. So there's some caveats within that as well. So all the research suggests that the best stock for utilising compensatory growth on are those that are 300 kilos plus and are probably gaining around about the 0.5 to 0.6 kilos per head per day during the period of nutritional restriction. So again, all the research suggests that cattle under 150 kilos or 6 months old generally don't do the catch up. And I think the same is probably true with the lower growth rate. So if you're below that 0.5 kilos, it's really hard then for stock to catch up. You don't see quite such a bounce, and that means ultimately that those stock will be older to finish weight than if they've been growing more consistently throughout their lifetime. So it's a real use this with care, but when you can use it, it's pretty valuable, and an ability again to make most of when we've got those real high growth rates, pasture growth rates in the spring. And also don't forget that low live weight gains over the winter, so this is another reason to make sure that you're still hitting those targets of 0.5 to 0.6 kilos during the restriction, is that low live weight gains over the winter can impact on meat quality. We'll often see that kind of layer of gristle and things if stock have had a bit of a severe restriction on nutrition. So bear that in mind as well. There's a meat quality issue as well as a taking longer or not catching up if you're hitting them too hard. Okay, so other opportunities. So this, cutting for forage is really about dealing with the surplus that we have. And it's really important to remember, though, that devalue of grass falls by about half a unit per day once grass starts to push up its stem. So depending if you're making hay or silage or what class of stock you're aiming it for, it's important just to make sure that you're still making a decision early about when to cut. And certainly increasingly see people on rotational grazing who will just drop paddocks out to help reset, and actually that's supplying them with a significant portion of their winter silage requirements, rather than specifically having set areas available for shutting off for silage. Mow and graze. This is really where you mow the grass ahead when covers have become a little bit too tall, and you're mowing ahead of grazing, so that it really works best on cattle. It's quite hard to encourage sheep to still eat because the pasture is actually starting to slightly go ahead, and you'll normally see people who are it works best when your covers are just over 3,000, maybe about 3,100, but no more than about 3,500, because it can be really still be hard to get them to eat once that pasture is really starting to go over. The only time we ever really heard of it working in sheep is on really high legume pastures, where, and particularly in kind of good hot dry weather where the legume wilts very quickly, you'll get really high intakes and really good growth rates off that. But I think that's more experience out of places like New Zealand. And although we've been having drier, warmer summers, it's an opportunity here. I think grazing of legumes is still probably absolutely fine of lambs here. So probably best left for cattle. But it does provide a great opportunity to reset pastures. That really allows you to mow right down, and they should go and tidy up behind you. The other option, yeah, if you are creep feeding, then stop feeding supplements, stop feed that creep feed unless that creep feed is specifically out, for example, ewes who are running with triplets. But if it's a routine sort of always providing creep feed, particularly for lambs, then don't be substituting the grass that you've already got available there. Make sure you've got your grazing management right through encouraging stock to be eating grass all the time rather than supplements as well. Supplements should really be as its name suggests, it should be a supplement to fill a gap. Defer the feed at pasture for feeding later. So this works reasonably well as we head into summertime and into later summertime, where particularly for those who are looking to outwinter, where we can shut off pastures, and depending where you're in the country or what kind of ground you're on, around any time from July through to August, maybe even early September. And leaving that pasture then with a long rest period until it's grazed again in the winter. So it tends to work really well. See plenty of people doing it with all grass wintering for ewes. You can go online and find out lots of details about how to all grass winter ewes if that seems like a good way to be able to reduce your silage or feed inputs. And also we're starting to see it particularly for outwintering and cattle, and supplementing deferred pasture with hay, particularly for suckler cows, as a way to manage winter and manage to have stock out grazing for longer over the winter. Important to note though, I think with that is, and generally we'll see that deferring grass over the winter, most of the data that comes back suggests that pasture quality maintains reasonably well through the winter, and it's sitting roughly around about good silage ME. But work out of Ireland certainly showed that come the new year, you tend to see a reduction in that ME. So just be careful depending on what class of stock you're looking to feed and if you're wanting to defer into the new year. And I think we're certainly seeing this winter, having had particularly wet winter in parts, that we're probably losing a little bit more of that deferred pasture than we would in a dry season, and that the quality might just not be there. Having said that, it's still a great way to be banking feed without incurring the cost of cutting, and aimed for the right class of stock is a really valuable tool. And also we'll touch on this a little bit later about grazing in wetter conditions. Taller pastures, certainly with a little bit of a trample effect, can hold up a little bit more or protect soils a little bit more from damage during wet conditions as well. So worth bearing in mind if that can fit into your system. The other option, reseeding or establishing a forage crop. I'm sure many of you do that already anyway. So just to deal with that surplus is to take one of the fields out and be putting in a different crop and allowing the opportunity to refresh some pastures. And as alluding to earlier, is about considering if you're getting your fertiliser applications right, and just only applying fertiliser in the spring, blanket across the whole grazing platform at a specific time can also lead you to grow more pasture when you don't necessarily need it. So it's worthwhile just considering if you can split the application of fertiliser and or the timing. Are you actually using your fert at the right time to be able to give you the pasture, or just adjust that grass growth curve a little bit. Okay, maintaining pasture quality and quantity. So this really starts to shift towards the livestock a little bit, because really what we're trying to do in our grazing management systems is manage for the pasture. How do we maximise pasture growth and pasture quality, but also maximise livestock growth rates? Yeah, so really our objective is to balance high pasture intake whilst maintaining that pasture quality. And I suppose data really shows that the most biologically efficient farming system, one, i.e., in terms of the pasture production, is one in which the maximum amount of pasture grown is utilised by the animals. However, as we've seen, and I'm sure some people have found this early days of rotational grazing, is the most profitable farm system is one that actually achieves high animal production targets. And we certainly see people starting to shift, because we do see a lower live weight gain per head on a pretty intensive high utilisation system, but you get that higher live weight output per hectare. But it's about finding what fits into your system best, and certainly the further north you go, where you're possibly under trying to finish stock before pasture growth stops, you also want to make sure that you're maximising that live weight gain per head, so that you're shifting stock through the system as well as possible. And yeah, just the slide's really just a reminder about pasture quality, and there's the difference, and this really kind of shows the difference between the maximum yield of digestible pasture, and as we all know, once grasses start to flower and start to put up that seed head, we really see a big reduction in pasture quality. And although that's different to the total maximum yield of dry matter, once we start to focus on the livestock, we really want to be at that maximum yield of digestible pasture. And the chart below just really shows the difference between stages of maturity between grasses and between legumes. And kind of covered this a little bit in the nutrition webinar that we did last week as well. But in the charts here, you can see crude protein. Obviously, protein's generally higher in legumes, but in the second column there is percentage NDF, which is just basically a measure of fibre. It gives us an indication of the digestibility of the feed. And ideally, yeah, where we see in the legumes, we're generally, until they're really into that full bloom stage, once they're over that 50% NDF, legumes are pretty consistently providing lower levels of fibre and much better digestibility than the grasses are. So I think that just also starts to shift us towards thinking about what pasture species that we have available, and making sure that we can still maximise growth rates. We can help manipulate that by making sure we've got good legume content in our pastures. And the ideal, even in a ryegrass white clover, is to have at least 30% clovers within that. Now I'll go back to what I was saying about the grazing pressure versus animal performance, and this chart starts to show that as we increase grazing pressure, so that's on the bottom axis, we start to see that the gain per animal starts to drop. So basically, because there's lots of competition for pasture, stock don't have that choice of that picking the perfect bit of pasture every time. We're also starting to see them grazing into slightly stemmier stuff as they do so. This will probably give us really good residuals and really good pasture regrowth, but it can impact on that per head per day growth. But as you can see in the dotted line of that, the gain per unit area of having slightly more or slightly heavier grazing pressure is slightly higher. So it constantly becomes this trade-off. The sweet spot is quite hard to find, but it's a constant trade-off between that. So you need to decide in your objectives what it is you want to achieve out of your system. So is it maximising the live weight gain per hectare, or how important is the live weight gain per head to you to achieving your objectives? And it's also to important that, because you'll see in the chart it notices about undergrazing or overgrazing, that neither very low nor very high stocking rates can really biologically use that pasture well. So that really means about utilisation. So it's quite hard to utilise well if you're over or undergrazing. And yeah, so it's about that efficient feed use, the balance between efficient feed use and adequate animal performance. Okay, so how do we maintain animal performance? Maintaining high animal growth rates and high pasture quality is really difficult, particularly, grasses want to hedge. We've kind of discussed that in the previous slide, so it is quite hard to achieve. But the tools we have in the box are using stock classes that have lower needs, such as breeding cows or dry sheep, as tools to be able to tidy up pastures or to take that lower quality pasture, whilst you leave high quality pastures for your higher priority stock who need really good digestibility. Daily shifts, not for everyone, but daily shifts also help, because if you're on daily shift, or the faster the move between paddocks, basically the shorter the period, the time they're on feed that is slightly less digestible. So if you imagine on daily shifts, every day they're getting a pretty balanced diet, and they will tidy up paddocks a little bit better. But equally, that can be a challenge management wise, and particularly if you have a lot of mobs within the system, and you're running different stock classes and different stock types, so cattle and sheep as well. So it can be a challenge. But yeah, there is a conflict between maintaining high pasture quality by working animals hard, and then having the high performance that you get with liberal feeding. So, and we can see here, this kind of ties into a little bit about monitoring stock performance as well, because the measurement of pasture height is probably the simplest and the best prediction of both pasture and animal performance. So I spoke a little bit earlier about set stocking, and if set stocking's what you want to do and suits your system, then absolutely great. And in here we tend to have these target heights for set stocking. So we can see in here under cattle, we can also see that these target heights actually increase a little bit as stock get older. So this is about ensuring high intake and accounting for the change in quality in pasture as we move through the summer. Lactating cows as well, we can just kind of see all the difference. And then obviously you can see in here with dry cows that actually we can take the pastures to the much lower level with dry cows. And that allows us to do the tidy up as well. Not dissimilar on sheep. So we can see here, dry ewes, we can be taking that target height lower once those ewes are dry. And we'll see the difference between twins and singles. So singles have or single ewes, particularly as we see here in lactation, their demands aren't quite as high as they are for twins. And then lambs as well. So those lambs need to have that higher target rate. So once you convert that into rotational grazing, we start to see, it's kind of not dissimilar. The difference is mostly coming into the entry height and then exit height. And I think keep an eye on these figures, because certainly there's work coming out of Ireland now as well, looking at having a higher exit height for finishing cattle. So 6 centimetres seems to be working reasonably well. And also that could probably apply. These are higher than you could also work to a slightly higher exit height on lactating twins as well. And again, this is where we can start to use different stock classes as well. And some people are certainly doing leader follower, where you have ewes and lambs running through a paddock first, then followed by cows and calves as well. So there's ways that we can achieve target residual heights with different stock classes as well. So, but it's a great way as a simple measure when you're out in the paddock every day, just making sure that you are ensuring that stock are well fed and you're hitting those targets to maximise pasture quality as well. And going back to why, as well, particularly in lambs, if you're grazing too hard as well, or grazing well down into low residuals, we can just see on this chart here is just where you find worm larvae, infective worm larvae in grass, and this demonstrates that predominantly we're seeing the most worm larvae well down into the pasture sward. So it's another reason, particularly for young stock, to make sure that you're grazing up to the slightly higher levels, so that you're not forcing them down into where there's higher levels of larvae and they're a greater risk of picking up worm infection. And then, we spoke, and we'll cover off again, about considering the different pasture species that we have available to us. And covered this off actually in the nutrition webinar too, but it just shows the difference between the quality and the growth rates that we can see. This is for lambs, but what benefit legumes bring into achieving live weight gain. And for a given pasture allowance, we see white clover well at the top within that, and in fact all the legumes sit well above and well above ryegrass. So, not to say ryegrass isn't an important aspect, but if you're running your pastures with at least 30 and to 40% of legumes, particularly white clover within there, then you're providing that opportunity for lambs in particular to have really high quality pasture. I just put up this chart really because somebody had asked him in the nutrition webinar about what the average yields were for some of the different species that we have for particularly for mixed species sward, but obviously that will cover off some of the grasses in here. And there's a real difference, and I think use these figures with care because there seems to be quite a lot of variation and when you go looking for what average yields figures are, and also because sometimes to get an average yield these are just grown in monoculture, which is slightly different to growing in mixes as well, but it just gives a bit of a feel for what kind of yields on average we'll see from each of the different species in there. But and also actually persistency, because persistency can be an issue, and how we graze, and particularly how long we leave rest periods, particularly once we're into things like chicory and plantain, will have an impact on persistency. But in terms of deciding what forage species we want to grow, these are all quite important aspects, because some of them are much shorter lived. Particularly we're seeing things like the chicory and red clover aren't going to persist for as long as, for example, ryegrass and white clover. So again, that's important to consider within your whole grazing platform and how you manage that. And also, I've still never seen one for all the different species, but although this chart gives you the average or the total dry matter yield, really what's important in considering your grazing platform is when that yield occurs across the season. So we can see here, and as we probably know, that grass does a pretty steep climb in May time, but actually the clover makes a nice complement as ryegrass growth drops off. The clover has a slightly different growth profile, and you'll see that with various different species. Just the slightly different growth profiles can just help you to manage to kind of flatten that curve, but ensure that there's still high quality pasture for stock as they go through the summer on into the autumn. So yeah, all plants have their strengths and weaknesses, and choosing a mix of species and varieties can help us build functional pastures to provide high quality feed when it's needed most. So that really involves about having a good understanding, again, what do you want to achieve, and how can these different plant species fit into your system well to enable you to still manage through to the winter, but also have that high quality feed in the summertime. And particularly as we're seeing, if we're hitting dry summers and things, some of these plants better suited to help us deal with those kind of dry spells. Okay, number 3 on our rules, if you remember, was about being flexible in management. So grazing management is not an exact science. We can give you lots of theory, but actually on the ground we get thrown so many curveballs, and particularly with things like the weather, that you're constantly needing to adapt and just make changes and tweak the system. Really important though is just keep monitoring and adjusting. And as I said before, weighing stock, measuring grass, or measuring particularly and just making sure you're hitting those residuals, or stock have the target grass height to go in and come out of fields, is probably the easiest and best way to be able to just have a good handle on the monitor. So are you hitting targets? If not, why not? Have a wee look. Number one, normally and particularly if you see drop in growth rates, particularly in lambs, but probably also in calves as well, post weaning, is just actually number one is, are they getting enough energy and are they getting enough intake? So are you putting them onto pastures that are really supplying exactly what they need? Okay, so I know some people are keen to get a better handle on dealing with the really tricky conditions that we're starting to see. So obviously we've had a few dry summers, and we're now hitting a very wet period. Certainly in some parts of the country it's very wet this winter at the moment, so we'll cover off dealing with the dry and the wet. So dealing with the dry, there's a saying in most of the places who have dry spells, whether it's in the States or Australia or other places, there are three key components to pasture-based sheep and beef production, and they are cash, grass, and livestock. And the saying is that you can't go bust with too much grass or cash, but you can with too much livestock. So really, that's about how you make decisions, and how you get through a tricky situation when you're hitting a period of low pasture supply. So dealing with dry, and I think probably particularly for us here who are in normally pretty temperate climate, the biggest challenge is not knowing exactly when the weather will break. Is it actually just going to last 3 or 4 weeks, or is this going to be a long period of summer dry? This tends to leads to a temptation to sit tight, and not make a decision, or not necessarily make big changes to your system, because it might not last for that long. But if you delay and the dry spell continues, then some of your options for dealing with it may start to look a bit less favourable. So, for example, if you need to be selling stock, you don't want to be hitting the market when everyone else is also needing to be selling stock. Or if there's suddenly a much higher demand for purchase feed as well, you don't really want to be in the same boat as everyone else. So this information just came from one of the discussion groups I used to work with, when we just kind of looked at what concerns were about what the challenges were of dealing with summer dry, what were contributing factors, and what were the possible solutions. So the key challenges that people felt with dealing with that particular summer dry was the potential lack of winter feed coming ahead, the lack of immediate feed in front of stock, and lack of cash flow. So most people still hadn't sold stock, hadn't sold lambs, or if they had, there were very few away, and also hadn't weaned and sold calves yet either. So what were the contributing factors that were impacting on that? And the key things that came up with was like not knowing how much feed that they currently had, not knowing how much feed that they would need, so, and to include that going into the winter. So growth rates was starting to delay lamb sales, so that was again impacting on cash flow. Not having really prioritised stock, so deciding on whether or not you should wean, etc., or who should get the feed that you did have available. Hitting a falling market, so as I said, you don't really want to be going in when everyone else is having to bail out and sell as well. Leaving it to the last minute to buy feed, or being stuck in the same old ways as you've always done it. Okay, so when we work through what the potential solutions were, so really fundamentally as well, know what feed you currently have in front of you. So have a measure of the pasture platform. What's there at the moment, and how does that look compared to the stock that you have? Do the feed budget for now and also into winter. So it's really important, because obviously if you've got lower growth rates now when we normally expect growth, then that can have a big impact. And also with our climate, our seasonality, if you start to heading into that period when we know we don't have growth actively coming ahead because of the change in the season, it's really important to be budgeting well ahead, at least 6 months ahead as well, to make sure you can get through the winter and not impact on next year's production. Another potential solution was deciding on that weaning earlier. So we know that you can wean within, and weaning date is a movable feast. So you can, for ewes and lambs, to wean at the 90 to 100 days is absolutely fine. If you want to wean slightly earlier, it is possible, but it's so important to make sure if you're doing that, you've got lots of really high quality feed ahead of them, and it's really clean, as in worm clean pastures to do that onto. So, but depending when you normally wean, you take that opportunity to pull the ewes off or pull the cows off, and to effectively then shift them onto maintenance, and depending what condition they're in as well, put them into maintenance and prioritise your feed for young stock. It's also an opportunity to cash in on any cull stock or unproductive stock that you have, and to consider selling store. So might not be all of them, particularly if you're dealing with lambs, but can you sell it, or should you look to be selling a proportion of them store to help reduce that feed demand? And again, that's part of doing the budget forward. Actually, do you have enough grass to be able to take them forward well? If you do want to buy in feed, do the sums on buying it in and just make sure that it will give you a return on investment. So do you think that the growth and the system that you can deal with by buying in feed will actually give you the return that you need? But I think fundamentally everybody came down to the final conclusion was that it's so important to have a plan in place and just stick to that. So other strategies that we see in places where you tend to have summer dry, make plans and take action earlier. You want to avoid those higher feed costs or lower sale values. So make the decision and stick with it, but make sure you've done the costings behind it and what's gonna deliver best for you, but also with an eye on what's coming ahead. Do a feed budget and match it to your cash flow. So again, that's really important. Don't necessarily be going in and buying in feed if actually your cash flow is not going to suit it. It may be more prudent to sell stock than to buy in feed. Keep a focus on your profitability and that future productivity. And don't waste feed on stock that you don't want to keep. So if you can sell cull stock early, if there's a few stock as well that you just don't really think should necessarily be in the system, you might be better off selling them now rather than feeding them. And if they're lower productivity stock anyway, that they don't necessarily give you that good return per head. Make sure that you are weighing or body condition scoring, particularly use that you're doing that and analyse pastures. So that's really about knowing what you've got at the moment and where you're at. And particularly in terms of body condition score and particularly for sheep, but feeding to maintain condition score is actually cheaper than trying to gain it. So it's really important if you're on that summer dry and you think ewes have lost condition that you're even before weaning that you don't want to be impacting them too hard because you want them to be in that right condition for tupping again and to make sure that you're not impacting next year. Use of nitrogen as well, just be really careful. Nitrogen you should only really use once recovery or once we've had rain. If your soils are dry, nitrogen won't trigger grass growth. And also it's important to remember that actually during the dry period, the grass actually won't be taking nitrogen that's in the soil. So what you don't want to do by applying nitrogen when it's still dry is overloading with a lot of nitrogen, which then you get this rapid uptake once it does finally rain. So you want to make sure that you're not effectively then producing high nitrogen pastures. So use it really carefully and only once you've had that rain back in to recover. And importantly, draw up a bit of a plan, but review it as conditions change because we don't know when it's going to rain again. And that might be sooner or it might be later than you anticipate. Okay, pretty pertinent to this winter now is grazing in wet conditions. And we talk a lot about soil health and how it's important to protect soils and not cause compactions. But it's a real challenge in our grazing systems that how can we manage to graze in wet conditions? So it's important to remember that soil damage from trampling will depend on a variety of aspects, and it'll depend on your soil type, how long stock are in a paddock, how many stock are in that paddock, what the live weight of the stock are, the cumulative rainfall. So how long has it been wet for? Has it been wet for days, weeks, months, or is it only just a few days wet? What are the drying conditions like, i.e. temperature and wind? And certainly in winter, there's less opportunity for drying than there is in summer. What's the sward type and age? So open swards, young swards are more prone to trampling damage than older permanent pastures are. What your pasture covers are. I mentioned this earlier about sometimes taller pasture covers actually if stock are going in and causing a little bit of trample on that can actually protect the soil a little bit from that trampling damage. And also something to consider is about what's the forecast ahead. Is it looking as if it's going to be wet ahead, or actually are we going to start to see some drying weather coming in behind? So they're pretty obvious, but avoiding damage, remove stock. So that's also going to depend where you are in the rotation. If you've got if you're on a particularly wet part of the farm, can you shift them onto a drained part of the farm? Can you house stock? Is that an option? It probably isn't for many, and certainly in sheep systems, it's not something we would see. Or do you have a sacrifice paddock or a sacrifice area? Different fields that you can shift them to. If you are paddock grazing, moving paddocks more frequently. So if you can shift on to daily, or some people I know do half day shifts once they're on into some wet weather, um, and not worry too much if they haven't hit their target residual. So this is really just about reducing the time and reducing the stocking density on the paddock that they're on. You can always come back and graze if you haven't hit, once it dries up, if you haven't hit that residual. Do you have opportunity for on-off graze? So again, whether that's into housing or into sacrifice areas, and we'll come on to on-off grazing shortly, because there's a bit of research looking at that. And as I said before, yeah, higher covers give some soil protection from trampling. So is that an opportunity, or do you see in deferred grazing? And if you know when your wet period normally happens, actually can you factor that into your grazing management, into your system, that you've got some areas of higher covers, maybe for cows, or even use at a certain stage of production, that you can put them onto where there's a little bit of trample as well, but actually you're just helping to protect that soil. But bear in mind that that leaves you with a lower utilisation, so you need to factor that in. So research and latest findings. So this has come from a project from Ireland looking at access time to pasture conditions and wet soil conditions. So what impact does it have? But actually it takes the look at the whole on productivity and profitability. So this is in pasture-based dairying. So it's important just to remember, and obviously dairy's slightly different in terms of they tend to have really easy access to housing and good infrastructure to be able to do this. But I think there's some really valuable points in here we can pick up that will be applicable to sheep and beef systems. So basically they tested a variety of grazing stroke housing mixes at different soil moisture levels. And that included on-off grazing, where even under slightly wetter soil conditions, cows were given access up to 8 hours day access grazing in the wet. The default, the control was really about cows were on 22-hour grazing if soils were dry. So that's how the experiment worked. So if it was dry, if soil moisture was low enough, it was fine to graze on, then everything was on 22-hour grazing. But if they hit a wet period, then there was different decisions made on the different groups. So one was to completely house, one was to house when it was a certain degree of wetness or not, and the others were to give them 8 hours access as an on-off grazing. Now, when they were doing the on-off grazing, the cows weren't offered any feed when they were housed. So the only feed they got was out grazing for those 8 hours. So the key findings from that were that there was less time. Yes, they found that less time spent at pasture under wet soil conditions did lower the treading damage. So that's not a surprise. The less amount of time stock are on, the less treading damage that occurs. But they did also find that this had no effect on the annual pasture production. So I think that's a use with care, because what they felt they were saying was actually you can see a slight recovery in grass production even after a little bit of trampling. So they're finding that on the total, and they're also looking at the total grazing system as well, that they were still growing, and this was a dairy, I think it was 14.8 tonnes of dry matter per hectare per year over that system, even if they were grazing some areas when soil conditions weren't quite perfect. What they found about the restricted pasture access was that it decreased the frequency of soil hoof interactions, i.e. there was less trampling, but it didn't affect the hoof print depth. So that's quite important, but actually it's so stock will still sink into the same depth effectively, but there's a little bit less trampling going on. And I wonder if that also starts to impact a little bit on whether that's why they didn't see the huge change in the total annual pasture production. So really important as well about the 8-hour access to grazing is that cattle can adapt their grazing behaviour in terms of their bite rate and their dry matter intake if they have restricted daily access. So basically what they're finding is that the cows were actually eating what they needed within those 8 hours. And I think there's other data from elsewhere in the world that will kind of back that up, is that they can manage to eat this effectively what they need. And I suppose the other point of this research was that if the alternative was housing on silage, then actually silage generally has a lower dry matter, lower ME as well than fresh grazed grass. So it always becomes a bit of a trade-off between housing and what they're being offered in house, which was silage, and what they're being offered outside. So they also found that reducing the trading damage to swards did not improve the productivity or profitability of the grazing system as a whole. And this was mostly because the damage only really happened on a small area of the grazing platform. So, like we're saying with paddocks, that actually, if you're limiting the area that damage can happen. Now, I know this is going to be difficult if you're in a really long-term wet period, and hopefully that doesn't happen too often. But if you can limit the areas of the grazing platform, then the system as a whole still isn't necessarily hugely impacted by it. So it's not to say that you're not causing some soil issues, but they tend to be very localised. And then dealing with the system as a whole, again, obviously labour costs increase with the less time spent at pasture. So this is why we want to be at pasture, because it's lower cost, it's lower labour, etc. And as soon as you start to put stock inside, that increases your costs. So that becomes the trade-off. If you're removing stock, making sure that where you're moving them to and how you can manage them within your system will have an impact on that profitability. So in short, it's complicated, but I think in short as well, it's about minimising if you are in a wet period, it's about minimising the time that stock are actually on areas that they can cause damage to. So in short, I think that probably still summarises it is a little bit like grazing management's a little bit like playing a board game like this. There's some key rules within there, about trying to match supply and demand, about maintaining pasture quality, providing pasture quality to maintain livestock output, and about being flexible. But there's a real variety of strategies that we have in place, and we've probably covered a lot in there. But if you're not sure, you still want to learn, then make use of people who are already doing things in your area, and tap into their expertise, and just really try and work out and see what can work for you. But so important to tie in, what are your objectives, what do you want to achieve on your farm, and how can grazing management help you achieve that. Thank you.